Depois de termos ouvido o administrador da ANAC, que nos deixou inúmeras reflexões, ouvimos agora o papel da IATA. Vamos ouvir qual é o papel da IATA em tempos de crise e temos connosco Lígia da Fonseca, Acting Country Manager Portugal da IATA, a quem chama ao palco. Muito boa tarde e bem-vinda.
Boa tarde, não sei se conseguem ouvir-me. Ok, agora sim. E a apresentação, também ia precisar ter a apresentação aqui, por favor. Muito bem. Deixem-me fazer uma breve introdução em português. Eu vou transitar para inglês, vou mudar para inglês, por duas razões. Primeiro, a IATA é uma associação internacional e, segundo e muito mais relevante, este é um evento cada vez mais internacional e, portanto, eu queria agradecer ao Presidente da Câmara Municipal de Ponte Sor por organizar este evento, à ANAC por ser parceiro, à NAV por ser parceiro neste evento e, naturalmente, por ter esta colaboração tão grande e tão especial com a IATA. I'm now switching into English. I hope you allow me to switch to this language. For the people that didn't understand me before, I'm switching to English not only because IATA is an international association, but also because we consider that this is more and more an international summit that needs to be inclusive for everyone to be able to follow. I'll be talking to you about the effects of aviation taxation in disruptive times. We have heard just before the impacts of the war, the impacts of the pandemic, but let's give it a face. Let's put a face on it. Let's see how it looks. I'll give you an economic outlook, a brief economic outlook on how this looks in terms of metrics. Let's start, Let's start with the economic growth that the IMF is expecting now for the upcoming years. You see the massive disruption we had in 2020. You can also see how 2021 was pretty spectacular, but you also see that the IMF is now slowing down their forecast because we will continue to have successive crises that will make our expectations of growth to be a bit more moderate. On top of this, we have massive inflation in many countries that only brings more disruption and more imbalance between the economies. And this is something that impacts globally every economy. Let's look now, I find this graphic very interesting, because if you look at the disruption caused by the 9/11 or the subprime crisis, you will see that there are minor disruptions. They're just like blips, a hiccup. But when you look at the impacts of the pandemic, you see that there is a very steep disruption, and the black line or the blue line that you see is our expected recovery with the pandemic or after the pandemic, and the red line would be the expected growth for aviation if we didn't have the pandemic. So as you can see, even in 2040, at the end of the graph, we still have a forecast that shows that traffic will still be at least 6% less than it was expected to be if we didn't have a pandemic. But of course, we have the pandemic, so now we have to deal with this, let's say, new normal and new reality. One important thing that I would like to show to you is how cargo is the green line that we see here. The importance of cargo during the pandemic is very interesting because it was actually the lifeline for many airlines that converted their airplanes to transport cargo, for instance, allowing them to continue to have some revenue that was so important during the times when passengers were not flying. As you can see, the domestic flights and the international flights, those are metrics, revenue passenger kilometer. The other one, this is very technical, it doesn't matter. I want you to have the visual feeling of it. How the passenger industry in total, the black line, when you compare it to the cargo line, you see that the passenger demand was extremely low and that cargo had a very relevant role to play for aviation. When we look at domestic markets, and those are the big domestic markets we have in the world, you can see how China has this V shape. So it's like a roller coaster. It goes up and down, following the closure of this internal market. You can see that the other economies were gradually recovering, with some hiccups indeed, but it was a bit more consistent. If you look at the USA, the blue line, so the domestic market for the US, it was gradually growing with not so many disruptions because the government policies allowed this. When we look at international traffic, we see the same. We see that Asia Pacific, a lot influenced by China, continues to have this low recovery, very slow recovery when compared to the rest of the regions. If you look at Africa, Europe, Latin America, Middle East, and North America, you see that their recovery is a bit more consistent, and this is the type of recovery that we would like to see also in Asia Pacific. But why am I showing you this? Because I want to bring you here a point that is extremely relevant. IATA's role is to try to avoid, in its interactions with governments and the other stakeholders, to try to avoid disruptions. And what was the major, or at least several major roles that IATA had during the pandemic? The first one, to preserve the airline's financial systems. I'm sure that the majority of you are aware that IATA has a big financial system that brings together all the airlines, and it was important for IATA that there was no bankruptcies or problems that would make the whole sector pay for the bankruptcy, for instance, of 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 airlines. On the other hand, and very important, we were looking for border harmonization for passengers to understand how they could travel, what were the regulations in place for them to travel, and this is a lot related with the other yellow box. We wanted to restore passenger confidence. We wanted passengers to trust in aviation and trust that they could fly. So we also had, despite the pandemic, and this is very important, despite the pandemic, we made the pledge that is the most ambitious pledge we have right now towards environment, to become net zero by 2050. And this is an effort that is now confirmed after the ICAO Assembly. It was confirmed by the states. It's an overall commitment across the board, airlines, air navigation service providers, civil aviation authorities, the states, everyone working towards the same goal. And last but not least, well, actually is the point that I want to raise your attention to. During the crisis, we were asking the governments to waive and or suspend taxes, charges, and fees imposed on airlines, allowing them to have this, let's say, oxygen balloon for airlines to survive. And this was precisely what happened in many, many jurisdictions, and we have to thank governments for this additional effort. But going on taxes, with this experience, we understood that taxes are very damaging for the aviation system. And I want to talk to you about how aviation taxation impacts aviation, the sector, but also, or especially during times of crisis, during times of disruption. I want you to bring your attention to this. So taxes, if you think about it, they're not a real source of revenue, let's say. They are transfer from the private sector money to the public sector, to the state budget, for instance. We know that imposing taxes brings the prices, the fares, they go higher. And with this, because the air travel is price sensitive, we have passengers traveling less. So we are inflicting less connectivity. We have less connectivity, we have less economic growth, and we know this. So maybe there are other ways to do policy in a positive way, but I'll show this to you a bit further away. So now let's go quickly on the types of taxes that exist, just for you to have an overall of the panoply of taxes that we have that are imposed on aviation. We have direct tax, we know this. Indirect taxation, we also know this. But then we have creativity playing along, and we have environmental and green taxes, like the carbon charges that we all know. And we have some special interest taxation, which are targeted to some areas of the economic development. For instance, the tourism tax or the solidarity tax that we have in some countries. What is IATA's position on taxation? Generically, we oppose any form of tax or fee where the resulting revenue is not reinvested in the aviation industry. This means if aviation is taxed, but then the money is lost and goes somewhere else to finance other policies, we cannot agree to this. And this actually goes against ICAO's principles, OECD's principles, so we're doing something wrong. If you go to the IATA website, or if you Google IATA taxation, you will go directly to the taxation page. You will see plenty of position papers that reflect on this and that provide the information and the background to fundament what I'm just telling you quickly right now in this brief presentation. We have guidelines for taxation of international air transport profits. We have the OECD's Memorandum of Transfer Pricing. I'm just giving you examples of many things that you can find there. On VAT, how tax exemption must be maintained for international level, and this is broadly accepted worldwide. And we also have, for instance, a position paper on environmental taxes and why very often environmental taxes don't work. They simply don't work. And I want to, towards the end, I know I'm running a bit late, I wanted to show you an example of a positive reinforcement and positive policy versus a negative policy. Let's take a look quickly to an example. So when we're talking about sustainability, everyone agrees that aviation must be committed to become net zero by 2050, and in the meantime must adopt every policy at their hand to become more sustainable. But if we have a negative policy or a stick, if we think of the duality between sticks and carrots, on the stick side, we have a negative policy. For instance, the creation of a green charge, when this green charge only increases the state budget, the government budget, and prices go up, as I explained before, demand and connectivity are negatively impacted. So this brings no benefit for aviation. There is no evidence that CO2 emissions decline. We just have revenue for the state, no benefit for aviation, no sustainability gains. On the other side, if we look at a positive policy, the carrot in this case, let's imagine that we would use the money, the public money, to invest in research and development for SAF. And I'm giving this example, but I could be speaking about hydrogen, or I could just be speaking about providing the infrastructure for electric aviation in the future to have their charging posts in the airports. So if we think about investing in research and development for SAF, the immediate outcome would be that we would expand, for instance, the number of pathways, of ways of producing SAF. So having more sustainable aviation fuel and more ways to create, to produce sustainable aviation fuel, for instance, to increase up to 100% of sustainable aviation fuel use in the airplanes, because nowadays it's not possible to have 100% SAF on airplanes. So those are all areas that could benefit aviation, and this would be an example of positive policy. Another thing that we could do, or governments could and should do, is to invest their monies in bringing the green premium or the delta between the conventional fuel price and the sustainable fuel price to bring the price down of sustainable aviation fuel. Bringing the price down of sustainable aviation fuel would make airlines more prone to adopt this technology, to be able to finance it, to purchase, to make the procurement, and to use it. And this would be to the benefit of all of us, because yes, in this case, we would have a direct impact on the CO2 emissions with sustainable aviation fuels, because as you know, the emissions are lower in the life cycle of the use of this sustainable aviation fuel. So with the little time that I have left, I would like, again, to give you the message. If you can only retain one message from this presentation that I just did, it's this one. We strongly oppose any form of tax and fee that doesn't bring any benefit for aviation. So in your interactions as aviation stakeholders, in your interactions with your governments, I'm not talking about Portugal only, I'm talking worldwide, in your interactions with the governments, please remind them that any tax or fee must be reinvested to the benefit of our aviation that we want to be more sustainable for the future. So I hope that we keep this message, and I hope that you help me in this journey to make aviation more sustainable, and that you enable with me that aviation brings value to economies and societies of the future. Thank you very much for your time.